I sent a note to my wife's desk while she was sitting at another man's table. She read it. She was visibly shaken. But she didn't get up. On the paper, I simply wrote, "Go ahead. I'm leaving." And I left. Not because I wanted her to stop me. But because there was nothing left to save. And when there's nothing left to save, silence is more honest than any scream. There weren't enough tears to wash away the filth of that moment. And no courage on her part to face her own cowardice. She stayed. She pretended it was just some conversation, but her hand trembled beside her glass. And even then, she didn't come back. She only tried later. When her lover disappeared. When guilt began to outweigh desire. When she finally understood that it wasn't just a mistake, it was the death of everything we once were. The pain of betrayal doesn't begin the moment it's discovered, but the next moment, when the betrayed realizes there's no ground left. That love has been treated as disposable, as if it could simply be exchanged for a night of excitement. Betrayal doesn't tear the heart apart immediately. It slowly erodes, memory by memory. And worst of all is when you realize that the betrayer, the one who should care, protect, and be a shelter, didn't even have the dignity to confess. I didn't hear it from her. I saw it. I saw with my own eyes what I never wanted to imagine. And in that moment, everything inside me died. She tried to justify it. Days later, she called, crying. She said it was a moment of weakness, that she felt a lack of attention, that it was just a need. As if cheating were the consequence of not receiving a hug at the right time. As if the love we built over years could be dissolved in a few minutes of insecurity. I listened to her. I heard every word. Because I deserved to understand what they destroyed inside me. But I didn't say much. Because there was nothing more that could be said. The silence, there, already spoke louder. And perhaps that's why she felt the weight of her own choice so strongly. Because there was no drama. There was no scene. There was no scandal. There was just a man standing before the ruin of a feeling that once sustained him whole. And a note. A simple note that sealed the end of it all. Betrayal breaks something you can't fix. Even if the other person regrets it. Even if you swear it was the last time. Because what's lost isn't just trust. It's the sacred. It's the purest part of a feeling that's now tarnished, unrecognizable, wounded. I didn't leave on impulse. The decision to leave wasn't driven by anger, but by clarity. And that's the worst pain for someone who's been betrayed, having no choice but to leave. Because staying would be betraying yourself. And I was no longer willing to abandon myself to maintain a marriage where only one of us was still trying. She couldn't handle the absence. She sought me out. She wrote to me. She said she didn't know what she'd done, that everything had gotten out of control, that she thought I'd never truly leave her. And perhaps that was her mistake, thinking my loyalty was synonymous with submission. That because I'd always forgiven small flaws, I'd endure the unforgivable. But there's a point of no return. And she crossed that point when she decided to sit at that table with another man, while still wearing the ring that once symbolized our world. Interestingly, it wasn't jealousy that consumed me. It was grief. Grief for everything I imagined we would experience together. For the unfulfilled plans. For the promises whispered at midnight. For the home we built that, suddenly, was no longer ours. I looked at that woman, from a distance, and didn't recognize her. She was the same as before, but with a different soul. A soul that was no longer mine. And it was there, as I walked out of that restaurant, that I began to understand what it truly means to lose someone. Not because they died, but because they lost themselves. And us. The cruelest thing about betrayal is that it makes us strangers. Even if we live under the same roof, sleeping side by side, it feels like sleeping next to a stranger. A body we know well, but which now harbors hidden intentions. Divided hearts. Unspoken words. And, worst of all, rehearsed lies. She said she loved me. And perhaps she meant it. But love without respect is just beautiful selfishness. And in that moment, I understood that I no longer wanted a love that made me bleed in silence. Time passed. Not much. But enough for fate, with its precise irony, to place a new person in my path. Someone who didn't promise perfection, but delivered presence. Who didn't deceive me with empty declarations, but offered me small gestures of care that, little by little, stitched together the part of me that had been torn. With her, I learned that love shouldn't be a suffocating rope, but a space where we breathe together. That fidelity isn't an effort, but a natural consequence of those who know the value of what they have. Meanwhile, the other woman was experiencing her own storm. The man she'd exchanged our story for had disappeared. She'd left behind the silence she'd given me the day she left me. She'd tried to call me. She said she didn't know what was going on in her head. That she wanted to come back. That she missed me. But the love I felt for her was no longer love. It was a memory. And memories, however beautiful, don't sustain a new beginning. They only teach us not to repeat the same mistakes. The reunion happened unexpectedly. One random afternoon, we crossed paths. She saw me. She stopped. She cried. She apologized. And I, now at peace with the past, smiled. I said all was forgiven. But forgiveness isn't for starting over. It's for closure. For gently closing a door that's already been opened too wide. And it was in that moment that she finally understood the weight of the choice she'd made. Because the love she lost wasn't just any love. It was a love that cared. That stayed. That fought. But when betrayed, it decided to leave, not out of pride, but out of dignity. And she didn't expect it. They never do. They believe there will always be time. That there will always be a chance. That true love has the obligation to endure even the unbearable. But what she didn't understand is that true love doesn't accept humiliation. It leaves silently. With a note. A simple note that says, "Go ahead. I'm leaving." But it didn't all end there. Because fate, which never forgets what it teaches, still had something in store for that repentant heart. She wanted redemption. She wanted to go back in time. She wanted to undo what could no longer be undone. And for a moment, he thought he could. Until the day came when she saw me holding hands with another woman. At peace. Without guilt. Without hurt. And she realized that her love was now hers alone. And that, no matter how much she loved me again, it was too late to love together. But what she did in that moment, how she reacted, what she said, what she tried, is something that still echoes like a whisper in the corners of my memory. And it was there, at that moment, that everything finally came to light. Welcome to the channel. Here, we don't romanticize betrayal, we condemn it. The stories you'll hear are fiction, but the feelings, they're real. Each storyline was created to show how one wrong choice can destroy lives, hearts, and futures. Let this serve as a warning: those who cheat always lose more than they imagine. Prepare yourself. What comes next is strong, painful, and shocking. Good story. Her name was Elena. He was Daniel. They met in an old bookstore downtown on a gray autumn Saturday, where they were both searching for the same forgotten copy of a French novel that had never been a bestseller but seemed to have been written specifically for them. Their gentle dispute over the book turned into conversation, then coffee, and before they knew it, they were walking beneath the trees that spilled dry leaves onto the sidewalks. Nothing about that encounter was extraordinary, and perhaps that's why it was so special. It was simple, real, natural. Daniel was a man of quiet habits, a quiet heart, and eyes that always sought more than they saw. Elena was intense, talkative, a bit impulsive, but with a delicacy that dismantled any emotional distance. The two didn't seem made for each other, but they clicked with an effortless ease. In the months that followed, they became inseparable. Their relationship grew as things grow when they aren't forced, with patience, with surrender, and with small concessions. It wasn't made of overwhelming passion, but of a calm love, the kind that fills you little by little and remains when everything else fades. Elena was enchanted by the way Daniel listened even to her silences, by the way he remembered details that even she had forgotten, like her favorite perfume, which she wore only on difficult days, or the way she organized her books by color, not by author. Daniel, in turn, was surprised by her enthusiasm for the world, by the way she saw beauty in the little things, by her courage to express her feelings even when it made her vulnerable. Their life together began in a small apartment on the third floor of an old building, with noisy plumbing and windows that creaked in the wind. But there, in that cramped space, they found freedom. They painted the walls the first weekend, even though they had no experience, laughing at the paint stains on their clothes and hair. They built a routine of coffee and toasted bread, discussions about bad TV shows, lazy Sundays, and kisses before bed, even when they were too tired to talk. The world outside kept spinning, but between those walls, everything felt safe, constant, predictable. And this predictability was what gave their love a sense of eternity. Years went by like that. Without major setbacks, but with countless moments that, though small, remained etched in their memories. A trip to the coast where it rained the whole time, but where they learned to laugh at their frustrations. A burnt birthday dinner because Elena forgot to turn on the oven, and they ended up ordering pizza on the living room floor, with a bottle of cheap wine. The night Daniel lost his job and felt he was failing her, and she held him in her arms as if he were the whole world, telling him that true love isn't measured by salary, but by presence. Friends saw them as an exemplary couple, the kind that inspired even the most skeptical. There was something firm, solid about them, as if they were molded for each other. And they believed it too. They believed it because they wanted to believe it. Because love is also a daily choice to endure, even when time begins to wear away the edges of what was once perfect. Over time, commitments grew, as did responsibilities. Elena was promoted and began working longer hours outside the home, bringing stress and goals home. Daniel reinvented himself after his layoff, starting a small business that required effort and discipline and gradually took up his time and worries. Conversations that once lasted into the wee hours were replaced by hurried, routine exchanges, and lingering hugs were replaced by quick kisses between appointments. There were no major fights, no arguments that broke down doors. What there was a silent buildup of fatigue, of distance, as if a river had begun to flow between them and neither knew how to build a bridge. Despite this, the affection remained. There was still love in the small gestures, in the coffee left ready, the clean towel folded on the bed, the quick message asking if the other had lunch. But something invisible had changed. It was as if they were in the same place, but on different frequencies. Daniel felt that Elena was more distant, more occupied with the outside world, less present in the things that once united them. But he said nothing. He didn't want to be the kind of man who complains about absence when he knows his partner is trying to handle everything. Elena, on the other hand, began to feel suffocated by a routine that no longer inspired her, as if something inside her was crying out for air, for novelty, for a feeling that would recapture that impulsive woman Daniel had met at the bookstore, and who now seemed buried under layers of obligations. The love was still there, but neither of them knew how to reach it. They tried a few times, they planned dinners, traveled to familiar places, looked through old photos as if trying to rediscover what they'd lost along the way. But the attempts felt mechanical, as if they were trying to force a flame that refused to rekindle. And the truth is, neither of them knew exactly what to do with it. Because the love didn't end all at once. It faded slowly, through the cracks in their routine, through unresolved silences, through small absences that, combined, formed an abyss. And yet, there was attachment. There was history. There was fear of losing something that had been too beautiful to be easily discarded. On Saturday nights, Daniel would wait for Elena to come home from work, even when she told him she had meetings until late. He'd sit on the couch with a glass of wine, the television on low, trying not to appear anxious, but counting the minutes. When she came in, tired, he'd smile. He'd ask how her day was, if she wanted something to eat, offer a shoulder massage. And she'd thank him, but always say she was exhausted. She'd go upstairs, shower, and go to bed early. And Daniel would just sit there, staring at the nearly empty glass, wondering if the silence was fleeting or permanent. Elena, for her part, felt a guilt she couldn't name. She knew she wasn't being whole there. That something inside her was restless, searching for meaning, yearning to feel alive again. But she didn't want to hurt him. She still loved him, or at least, she thought she did. But she also wanted to find herself again, and that reunion required space. And perhaps, without realizing it, she'd begun to create that space within herself. A space where Daniel no longer fit in the same way. In the neighborhood, no one suspected a thing. They were still the smiling couple who greeted each other at the bakery, who walked their dog together on Sundays, who organized quiet dinners for close friends. But those who looked closely, very closely, might have noticed the blank look in Elena's eyes as Daniel talked about his new projects. Or the way he avoided asking about her new boss, knowing any question would sound suspicious. It was a subtle game of self-preservation, where each treaded carefully so as not to hurt the other further, even as they were slowly hurting themselves by the lack of truth. Their love was never fragile. But it wasn't impervious either. And sometimes, even the most beautiful loves are lost because they don't know how to ask for help at the right time. That particular week, Daniel had planned something simple. Dinner at home, wine, music, maybe a movie they used to watch when they first started dating. He wanted to surprise her. He wanted to try again. He thought it was still possible to recapture something of what they once were. He prepared everything carefully, put on his best shirt, even rehearsed what he would say. But Elena was late. She didn't answer the phone. And when she finally arrived, she wasn't alone. From then on, nothing would be the same. Daniel wasn't a suspicious man. He'd always believed trust was the cornerstone of any true relationship. But as the days went by, something about Elena began to feel different. Her schedules became more irregular, her apologies increasingly evasive, and there was a kind of rush in her eyes, as if she were always thinking about something she wasn't saying. She was still kind, still asked how he was, still kissed him before leaving, but the kisses were automatic, weightless, lacking the softness of someone who feels it. Her eyes, once so transparent, now hid something behind every smile. And even without proof, Daniel began to sense something off in that seemingly intact routine. He tried to ignore it. He thought it was just fatigue, that maybe she was going through a difficult time and didn't want to worry anyone. After all, she'd never been good at asking for help. But deep down, a bitter seed was beginning to sprout inside him, the same one that grows when instinct tries to warn what reason refuses to accept. She started going out more. She began saying that work dinners were becoming more frequent, that projects required networking outside the office, and that, unfortunately, weekends would also start to be taken up with meetings and events. Daniel believed her. Or tried to believe her. Because when you're in love, denial is always more comfortable than the truth. He wanted to trust her. But he began to notice small, almost imperceptible details. The perfume she wore before going out wasn't her usual, it was more striking, more intense. Her clothes were more carefully chosen, coordinated, as if the occasion required more than professionalism. Her cell phone, which used to be left lying around the house, was now always silent, face down, and locked with a password. When he asked about her day, her answers were generic, vague, punctuated by a forced smile. There was something in her voice, something Daniel couldn't explain, but that hurt him as if it explained everything. One night, Elena left her coat in the car and asked him to get it. As she reached for it in the back seat, her phone, which was in her pocket, vibrated. It wasn't a message. It was a reminder, dinner at 8 p.m., the same day and time she said she was at an online conference. Daniel froze. It was a simple detail, it could have been anything. But doubt, once established, began to erode the foundations he'd been trying to maintain. That night, he didn't sleep. He stared at the ceiling, while Elena, beside him, breathed deeply as if at peace. And that hurt more than any scream. Because there, in the apparent normality of her breathing, lay an abyss that could no longer be ignored. He began to observe her with different eyes. The hugs that ended too soon, the glances that avoided his, the excuses that couldn't resist a little attention. He didn't want to invade privacy. He didn't want to check messages or follow her steps. He wanted to believe that if something was truly wrong, she would have the courage to tell him. But the days dragged on with that invisible tension between them, as if they lived under the same roof only out of habit. Daniel couldn't smile like he used to, and Elena pretended not to notice. She talked about work, about future plans, but avoided any mention of the two of them as a couple. And this created a void between their words, as if their own story were being pushed to a place where it could no longer be touched. On a random Saturday, Daniel decided to try again. He carefully planned dinner, bought her favorite wine, and prepared the recipe they'd made together the first month they'd been together. He tidied the house, lit candles, and played the song she always asked him to repeat. There was no special date, but he wanted that night to be a breather, an attempt to recapture what might still exist between them. He texted her asking what time she'd be home. She quickly replied, she was still at work, had a last-minute meeting, and didn't know how long it would take. He replied, okay, and blew out the candle on the table. Around 9 o'clock that night, tired of waiting, he left the house to go for a walk. He had no destination. He just wanted to clear his head. But as he walked through the streets, damp with the light drizzle that was falling that night, he spotted an image from afar that froze him. Sitting at a corner table in a small, discreet restaurant was Elena. She was laughing with someone. A man. He wasn't a coworker, he knew that. There was something intimate in the way they looked at each other. She was beautiful. She wore the dress she usually chose for important occasions. And the smile she wore wasn't the automatic smile he received at home. It was light, genuine, carefree. Daniel didn't approach. He didn't make a fuss. He just watched. And something inside him broke into silence. He walked home aimlessly. The path seemed longer. Each step was heavy, as if carrying the weight of years of shared time crushed by a truth he hadn't asked to see. When he arrived, he sat on the sofa and remained there, motionless. Dinner was still on the table, now cold. The wine was no longer meaningful. The burned-out candles left a trail of smoke in the air, as if even the scenery had realized it was too late. From his pocket, he took a piece of paper and wrote a few words. He folded it carefully, placed it in an envelope, and slipped it into his coat. The next night, Elena went out again. She said she had to take care of something unexpected. This time, Daniel didn't ask for details. He just nodded. He waited an hour, then went to the same restaurant. There she was. With the same man. The same enchanted expression, the same intimate gestures. Daniel walked up to the counter, discreetly called the waiter, pointed to her table, and handed her the note. He simply asked him to deliver it without saying who sent it. The waiter, an attentive young man, accepted it without question. Then Daniel left. Without looking back. Without waiting for a reaction. In the note, there was only one sentence. One that said all he needed to say, go ahead. I'm leaving. That same night, he gathered some clothes and documents and left the apartment. He didn't want to be there when she returned. He didn't want to hear excuses, empty promises, or belated explanations. The pain of seeing, with his own eyes, what his instinct had been screaming at him for weeks was enough. He didn't need more. And neither did she. The next day, she called. Countless times. She texted. She said she needed to talk. That things weren't what they seemed. That it meant nothing. Daniel didn't answer. He remained silent. Silence, then, was the only language available. But there was something more to come. Something that hadn't yet been revealed. A detail hidden between the lines of that new chapter, one that would forever change the way he viewed everything he'd experienced. And this detail, yet to be discovered, carried a greater weight than any betrayal. 2 months had passed since that night at the restaurant. Since the note. Since the end. Elena tried to maintain some dignity at first, sending restrained messages, asking only for a chance to talk, citing confusion, exhaustion, and broken promises, unable to find the courage to even name the betrayal. But as Daniel's silence remained unshakable, she began to lose herself. First in her attempt to justify what she had done. Then in the desperate urgency to reclaim something that no longer existed. His absence from her routine turned the house into a field of echoes. His clothes in the closet became noise. The coffee habitually left on the shelf was now just coffee. Mornings became gray and empty, as if everything that fulfilled her had evaporated the moment she chose what she shouldn't. She searched for him in every way. She waited in front of his brother's apartment building, called mutual friends, wrote long emails asking for just 10 minutes to talk. No response. Daniel's absence weighed more heavily than any anger. Because she knew. She knew he was the kind of man who, when he decided to leave, never came back. Not out of pride, but because he didn't know how to live amidst broken pieces. When he left, he didn't just take her clothes. He also took the peace of that house, the sense of belonging, the mature love that she, through weakness or arrogance, believed would last forever. And the cruelest thing was that the man for whom she had risked everything vanished. Without explanation. He disappeared from social media, ignored calls, ceased to exist the very second Daniel left the scene. There were no flowers, no continuity, not even a request for her to stay. Her lover left as if he had never intended to stay. And for the first time, Elena understood what it was like to truly lose herself. One day, without planning it, they met eyes in a small cafe where, ironically, they often went together on Sunday afternoons. Daniel was sitting with a woman, and even from a distance, she noticed his tranquility. The serenity of someone whole again. What she watched, silently, wasn't just her ex-partner with someone else. It was the realization that he had managed to move on. That she had been left behind not only by him, but by time, by history itself, by the life that continued without the slightest effort to forget her. Seeing them smiling together, Elena understood that the place that had once been hers had been taken. And there, amid the clatter of cutlery and the chatter of others, she cried. Not out of jealousy, not out of loss. She cried because she finally understood what had broken her. Later that day, her throat tight with shame and regret, she wrote a letter. Not a letter of apology, but of acknowledgement. She didn't beg for him to return, didn't ask for an explanation. She wrote to say she knew what she had done, that she knew the value of what she had thrown away, and that now, seeing him happy with someone else, she could clearly see what she had lost. She folded the paper, put it in an envelope, and walked to his apartment. Upon arriving, she hesitated. The building was different. He had changed. A man came out of the lobby and, noticing she seemed lost, asked if she needed help. She simply thanked him and left. The letter stayed in her purse. 4 days. Until she decided to leave it at the bookstore where they had met. She asked the clerk, already familiar to both of them, to deliver it if he showed up. And then she left. Without looking back. Almost 2 weeks later, Daniel found the envelope. He wasn't surprised by the handwriting. He read it standing up, still between the shelves. The letter was brief but sincere. And when he finished, he felt no anger. No pain. He felt a distant kind of compassion, a disconnected tenderness. And then he decided to respond. He took a sheet of paper from his notebook and wrote right there, standing, without much thought, all is forgiven. But forgiveness doesn't mend what was broken. It only closes the door gently, so that each person can go on in peace. He left the letter in the bookstore, in the same envelope. And he left. 2 days later, Elena returned to the place, silently hoping that something still existed. She received the letter's reply and read it right there, sitting in the same armchair where he had once read passages from books to her. The pain was almost physical. The calm of his words was a goodbye far deeper than any scream. It was the end. And then, as she looked around, still processing what she had lost, she heard the voice of a staff member say her name. They handed her a piece of paper that had been forgotten inside a book she used to read on Sunday afternoons. A note. A draft of a letter, written by Daniel, which she never delivered. The paper was crumpled, stained, but still legible. And in it, a single sentence knocked her off her feet: "If one day you tell me it was all a mistake, I will still know that I loved alone in the end." She left the place exhausted. She walked for hours, feeling exposed, naked, as if everything in her had been ripped away. The pain of knowing he had suffered in silence while she surrendered herself to another man was now unbearable. But what she didn't know, what no one knew, was the real reason for her lover's disappearance. Weeks later, while trying to retrace that man's steps, she found out. It wasn't through social media or messages, but by chance. A mutual acquaintance, a former coworker, met her at a cafe and asked bluntly how things were with the man. Elena, unsure of what to say, just shook her head. The man then laughed, somewhat bitterly. "It's funny how he disappears like that, he's done it before." Elena, confused, persisted. "And then he explained, didn't you know? He only approached you out of revenge. Years ago, Daniel refused to publish a book of his, an independent publishing proposal that he considered his life's work. He said Daniel was arrogant, that he treated him with disdain. Since then, he's been saying that one day he would make him pay. He always said he would rip away what Daniel loved most just to prove he could." Elena stopped breathing for a few seconds. She tried to understand if it was a joke, a mix-up, an exaggeration. But the details were too many. The book, the event where the supposed writer appeared, everything fit together. The man she'd gotten involved with wasn't in love. He was acting. Every gesture, every word, every encounter, every touch, everything was part of a plan she couldn't see through. She'd been used. Manipulated. Turned into an instrument of a reckoning that had nothing to do with her. And suddenly, all the guilt, all the shame, all the weight multiplied brutally in her chest. Because it wasn't just a betrayal. It was the cruelest betrayal that could exist, giving one's own love to a stranger, while destroying the one who had always been by her side. She fell to her knees in her room, alone, with no one to hear the silent scream that rose from her soul. She tried to call Daniel, but there was no longer a number. She tried to write, but there was no way to deliver it. She tried to search for the man, but he no longer existed under the name he used. The profile had disappeared. No clue. Only emptiness. And in the midst of that despair, she felt small. Humiliated. Torn apart inside. Because she discovered that she had not only betrayed him, she had been complicit in a cruelty that destroyed a good man. A man she had sworn to love. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat on the living room floor and stared at the bare walls, where once there had been photos, memories, promises. Everything was now gray. A hostile silence filled every corner. And the only voice that still resonated was Daniel's, saying so calmly that he was forgiven. But his forgiveness was the final sentence. The love was gone. The man too. And now, all that remained was the echo of a choice that could no longer be undone. And Elena finally understood what it meant to lose not only someone, but the right to be remembered fondly by the one who had once truly loved her. Time, with its insensitive coldness, moved on as if nothing had happened. But for Elena, the days no longer had the same shape, the same taste. Everything seemed faded. The sun, when it rose, merely illuminated a landscape where she no longer belonged. Regret became her new routine, and each morning, she woke further away from the woman she had once been. The weight of the newfound truth was not just a silent pain. It was a shame that lingered in every gesture, in every lost glance in the mirror. Memories of Daniel, once tender and gentle, were now laden with guilt. She could no longer recall his voice without her eyes welling up. She thought of every small gesture of his, every sacrifice he had made for love, and now she understood the abyss of loss not only as a consequence of betrayal, but as the consequence of having been naive enough to fail to see the evil in others. She could no longer bear to stay at home. The walls seemed to demand explanations. Objects became witnesses to her mistake. One day, in an attempt to breathe something new, she traveled to the city where Daniel had been born, where he used to visit his parents before they passed away. There was no one else there, but she remembered how tenderly he spoke of that place. It was a desperate urge for connection, as if walking the same streets he had walked could bring her some kind of solace. She spent 2 days wandering through squares, old cafes, local bookstores. Time seemed slower there, almost cruel. Until, by coincidence or fate's punishment, she saw him again. He was holding hands with the same woman from the cafe. Elena stopped on the other side of the street. She wanted to run. Scream. Tell him everything she had discovered. That he had been a victim, that she had also been deceived, that she didn't know, that it had all been a show. But she remained still. They walked, smiling, talking as if the world were light. The woman touched his arm naturally, and he smiled with a look of peace that Elena didn't remember seeing even on the best of days. Hours later, she decided to write another letter. This time not to apologize, but to tell him. She needed him to know what had happened, to get it off her chest. She wrote slowly, choosing her words carefully, telling him how she had discovered the truth, describing the feeling of having been manipulated, used, and how it all destroyed every day of her life. She concluded by saying she expected no forgiveness, no return, just that he knew she had found out. She sealed the envelope and left it at the hotel reception where she had seen him entering with his new partner. The next day, when she returned home, she found something she hadn't expected. A message. Just an address, a day, and a time. It was him. When she arrived, she recognized it immediately. It was the park where they used to walk after work, in the first months of their relationship. A simple place, with tall trees and a wooden bench near a small lake. He was there. Alone. Sitting, as if he'd been waiting for some time. She approached slowly, hesitantly, as if unsure if she had the right to be there. When he saw her, he didn't smile. He just gave a slight nod, as if to say, "Sit down." And she sat. For a few seconds, neither of them said anything. Only the sound of the wind rustling through the leaves filled the space. Daniel broke the silence. He said he'd read the letter. He'd already suspected something was wrong with the other man's behavior, but he'd never imagined something so calculated. He said he'd felt angry for a while, but then the anger dissolved into weariness. That there was no more room for resentment. Elena listened to him, her eyes fixed on the floor, her hands trembling on her knees. She tried to speak, but he interrupted her, not harshly, but firmly. He said he wasn't there to listen to excuses, nor to reopen wounds. That he'd already moved on. But he needed to make one thing clear, that the forgiveness she heard in that letter wasn't rhetorical. He truly had forgiven her. Because he'd understood that holding on to it would only keep him trapped in a past he could no longer change. She looked up with difficulty. And then she said what she needed to say. That she wasn't there to win anything back. That she no longer had any hope. But she needed to look him in the eye and say, "I'm sorry. Not for choosing the other guy. But for not seeing you. For not protecting what we built. For letting you suffer alone for something you didn't deserve. I was wrong. And I will carry that mistake for all my remaining days." Daniel just nodded. He didn't say, "It's okay." He didn't say, "I was wrong too." Because he knew that sometimes silence was the only fair answer. Elena then stood up, but before leaving, she asked him if he was happy. He looked at the horizon and replied, unhurriedly, that he was now. He said he had found someone who listened to him. Who stayed when it was easier to run away. Who gave himself without pressure, and who knew how to love without trying to win. He said that, strange as it may seem, the pain he had experienced had led him exactly to that point. He didn't wish that on anyone, but if he had to relive it all, he would. Because he had learned to love himself more than he loved the idea of forever with the wrong person. She didn't cry. The tears didn't come. Because there was a pain deeper than crying. The pain of acceptance. The pain of truth. She knew she was no longer part of his life. That he now belonged to a world where she didn't fit. And she respected that. She simply lowered her head, gave a slight, mirthless smile, and walked away. Daniel stood there for a few more minutes before getting up and walking the other way. That same night, Elena returned home and deleted all the photos she still had on her phone. She threw away any objects that still carried his scent. She turned off her phone, dimmed the lights, and for the first time in weeks, slept without dreaming. There was nothing left to do. The story had ended. Not with slammed doors, nor with screams. But with the kind of silence that only exists when there are no more words to say. Across town, Daniel was preparing dinner with his new partner. He didn't say anything about the encounter. There was no need. It was part of a closed chapter, now resting on the shelf of memories that are accepted but not revisited. They toasted with white wine, laughed at something silly, and when they looked at each other, there was something rare there, tranquility. The certainty that love, when it's true, doesn't hurt to exist. And that those who choose to betray don't just lose the person they had, they lose the right to be remembered as someone worthy of having been loved. And that's how the story ended. With dignity. With scars. But above all, with learning. Because betrayal, no matter how destructive, never has the last word. The last word belongs to those who survived it. And chose to start over. That night, after their reunion in the park, Elena walked the long blocks home. The weight on her shoulders seemed greater than any physical exhaustion she had ever felt. Inside her was a strange mixture of pain and liberation. On one side, the irremediable certainty that everything was over for good. On the other, the feeling that, by finally looking Daniel in the eye, clear of vanity and lies, she had at least regained the dignity to acknowledge what she had caused. But even that dignity, at that point, was fraught with sadness. Because nothing she could say or do would be able to give him back what she had destroyed. The knowledge of this wasn't a punishment, it was a silent prison from which there was no escape. For the first time in a long time, Elena felt she was facing herself, and the reflection in her eyes was unbearably real. The house they once shared now felt smaller, more cramped, as if it were shrinking as she clung to the past. The sofa, the paintings, the faded living room rug, everything told the story of a love that faded due to poor choices. Every corner held a subtle reminder of what was lost, and none of them offered comfort. It had become a kind of museum of memories, a physical space frozen in time where she was the only visitor. It was strange to realize that, no matter how much time moved forward outside, inside that house, everything remained stuck on the day Daniel left. In the following days, Elena tried to regain some semblance of normalcy. She returned to work, had lunch with colleagues, and answered phone calls she'd previously ignored. She smiled when expected. She pretended she was fine so she wouldn't have to explain the truth. But her mind was elsewhere. Inside, a whirlwind of thoughts pushed her toward a difficult dilemma: how to move on when she knows the most genuine love she's ever had is no longer available, not on a whim, but because she destroyed it herself. Most people around her saw her as someone who'd ended a relationship and now needed to start over. But no one knew the details. No one knew about the cruelty disguised as affection, the gamesmanship she'd suffered, the rash choice, the silent betrayal. It was a suffering that was not shared, because guilt doesn't always provide solace. Daniel, for his part, was living different days. He had found a new tranquility, a lighter way of being. The woman with whom he now shared his days didn't try to take up too much space, didn't demand constant proof of love, didn't suffocate him with demands, but welcomed him with presence and maturity. She had entered his life at a time of rebuilding and knew how to respect every silence, every memory, every limit. Little by little, he realized that it wasn't necessary to carry grudges to move forward. That forgiveness doesn't require an answer, and that freeing oneself from pain doesn't mean ignoring the past, but recognizing that it no longer needs to dictate the present. Still, at times, usually in the quietest of nights, Daniel found himself wondering what would have happened if everything had been different. Not out of longing, but out of human curiosity. An unanswered question that knocked on the door and soon left on its own. One afternoon, while organizing some old books that had been boxed up since the move, Daniel found a notebook filled with notes from the time he still lived with Elena. They were simple entries, grocery lists, recipe ideas, random phrases. But among the pages, there was a different note. A small note written by her in hurried, almost childlike handwriting, saying, "If I ever forget how good you make me feel, please remind me." Daniel read it 3 times, without reacting. He felt a brief tightness in his chest, an almost painful nostalgia, but it disappeared as quickly as it came. He closed the notebook, took a deep breath, and returned to his task. That sentence, in that moment, no longer held any weight. It belonged to a story long gone, to a time when they were both different. Meanwhile, Elena began avoiding the places she frequented with Daniel. Not out of fear of running into him, but out of respect for her own grieving process. She understood that it wasn't about erasing memories, but about allowing them to occupy a quieter place within her. She started walking at different times, changed her route to work, and switched supermarkets. Small changes in her routine that, little by little, helped her heal. However, the main wound, the one that doesn't bleed on the outside, was still raw. It was the realization that true love, once lost, cannot be replaced. One can love again, yes. But love that is betrayed cannot be returned. And that isn't punishment. It's a consequence. An unexpected invitation brought her closer to Daniel. A couple of mutual friends, who hadn't taken sides during the breakup, decided to bring together old friends for a reunion dinner. Elena almost refused, but something inside her, perhaps the need to confront her own ghosts, made her accept. Upon arriving, she felt a heavy air. Many still didn't know the details. Others knew, but maintained a polite distance. When Daniel arrived with his new partner, their eyes met for just a moment. It was enough. There was no more pain there. There was respect. But a cold respect, which didn't extend to longing. During dinner, the mood was light. Small talk, restrained laughter, stories reminisced. At one point, one of the friends commented on how strange it was to see everyone there again and suggested a toast, to new beginnings. The glasses were raised, but Elena's gaze wavered. Starting over isn't always a choice. Sometimes it's an imposition of life when you can't go back. After dinner, as they said goodbye, Daniel approached her discreetly. He gently said he wished her peace. And for the first time, Elena understood that peace wasn't the same as love. And that sometimes, when everything ends, all that's left is truly just that, wishing the other person well, even from afar. The following week, Elena decided to sell the apartment. It was the last physical connection she had with the life that no longer existed. She calmly organized her belongings, separating everything that no longer made sense to carry. She donated clothes, photos, books. She kept only a simple ring Daniel had given her for her birthday, not because of its value, but because, somehow, it still carried the memory of who she had been before everything went wrong. She moved to a smaller, brighter apartment, with wide windows through which the wind blew freely. She didn't know exactly what came next, but she was willing to start small, to rediscover herself, to understand who she was now. Not to win anyone back, but to stop being held hostage by a mistake. Daniel, for his part, continued his new life with simplicity. He didn't make long-term plans, didn't idealize distant futures. He lived his days with more presence, more calm. He loved with less urgency. He had learned, the hard way, that life can turn upside down in minutes. Therefore, he valued the shared silences, the unhurried coffees, the hugs that didn't require words. Sometimes I thought of Elena with a distant tenderness. Not out of love, but because I understood that they were both victims of circumstances, of failures, of unfinished versions of themselves. And this, as painful as it was part of the journey. The moment had arrived when consequences began to give way to acceptance. When wounds, though still raw, no longer hurt to the touch. Choices had been made, paths ran parallel and, finally, without intersections. And in the mature silence of all that was no longer said, the stage began to form for an outcome that sought not redemption, but understanding. Life went on. But not for everyone in the same way. And, as always, fate still had one last piece to move. 2 months after the dinner with friends, Elena began to live at a pace that bordered on automatic. The new apartment, though brighter and quieter, didn't offer her what she was looking for, because she didn't even know what she was looking for anymore. She organized the new house like someone trying to organize internal chaos, but there was something there that obeyed no possible order: emptiness. It wasn't about Daniel anymore. It wasn't about the man who deceived her anymore. It was about her. About the woman she had become after everything. About the kind of silence that sets in when love doesn't return, but conscience keeps speaking. She passed the days as if serving an invisible sentence, and the nights became too long for someone who no longer had clear dreams. There was no more pain, only the slow, dense, painful realization that time doesn't heal when guilt is greater than regret. It was then that, almost by accident, she ran into Daniel's sister again at a book fair. They were both alone, and the shock was mutual, though brief. There was no coldness or hostility, but the conversation began with the caution typical of someone carrying a history too delicate to ignore. They walked side by side through a few aisles, and at one point, her sister commented on how different Daniel was: lighter, more centered, more himself. Elena didn't respond immediately. She just took a deep breath and shook her head with a small smile. She wanted to say she was rooting for him, but the words wouldn't come. Then her sister stopped, looked into her eyes, and said in the calmest voice in the world, "You did everything wrong, Elena. But I know you loved my brother. But loving isn't enough when we forget how to care." Those words echoed inside her for days. Not as an accusation, but as the most sincere realization anyone had ever given her. That same week, she decided to do something she'd long avoided: revisit the place where it all began. The old bookstore was still open, now under new management. The furniture had moved, but the essence of the place remained, lingering in the shelves, in the smell of old books, in the small notes left in suggestion notebooks by customers. Elena walked through the aisles with a nostalgia that was no longer romantic. It was melancholic. She picked up a copy of the same French work that had once brought them together and leafed through it unhurriedly, as if searching within for a clue to who she had been. She sat in the back of the store and remained there for almost an hour, silent, while the city spun outside, in no hurry to include her again. On the other side, Daniel's life was taking on new contours. His business was growing steadily, and his new partner became not just a partner, but a significant presence in his daily life. There was no excess, no dependency, just a genuine, mature, and honest coexistence. They had differences, of course, but these differences weren't walls, but bridges they both crossed willingly. He didn't talk about the past, not as someone who denied it, but as someone who understood it. Sometimes, during a walk or in a longer conversation, memories would surface. But he treated them as one treats old letters, with respect, without attachment. The love he experienced with Elena wasn't a lie, and therefore deserved to be kept in peace. But it was, above all, a closed chapter. One morning, while visiting a cultural center where a photography exhibition was being held, Daniel recognized one of the images. It was one he had taken years ago, on a trip with Elena to a historic city. Elena herself had submitted the photo to a contest, unbeknownst to him, and had apparently been selected for the exhibition. He stood there, staring at the image, as if gazing at a part of himself that no longer existed. Beside the photo was a small plaque with the author's name and a discreet dedication, "To the one who taught me to see beauty where no one else did." Daniel read it, sighed, and then walked away. There was no resentment, but there was no longing either. There was only a rare kind of respect that arises when two people understand that they no longer belong to each other, but that they were once important in a way that time cannot erase. That same afternoon, Elena received a call she hadn't expected. It was from an unknown number, but she answered. On the other end, a polite voice introduced himself as the curator of the photography exhibition. He said he'd learned of her relationship with the photographer and that, since the exhibition was ending soon, he'd like to deliver the image to her personally, if she was interested in keeping it. Elena didn't hesitate. She made an appointment and went to the location. When she arrived, the photo was already packaged. The curator simply smiled, praised her thoughtfulness in sending the material, and said that rarely does someone do so generously for another. Elena thanked him but didn't explain anything. She took the photo, left the building, and walked to a nearby cafe. She ordered a tea and stood there, staring at the package. She didn't know whether to open it, keep it, or destroy it. That image wasn't just a memory. It was a reflection of a time when she still knew how to love properly. He kept the photo in the closet of their new home. Not as an altar, but as a silent reminder that love is fragile. And that, when poorly cared for, it fades without warning. The next day, she received a voicemail from Daniel's sister. Short. To the point. It simply said, he heard about the photo. He smiled. He said that, even after everything, it's still beautiful when someone remembers you fondly. Elena listened to the message several times. She didn't cry. She didn't wait for anything more. This was the end she needed. An end without promises, without new beginnings, without pending conversations. Just the certainty that, for a brief moment, she had managed to leave something beautiful behind, even if her presence was no longer part of his life. In the days that followed, Elena began to write. Not about Daniel, nor about what she'd experienced. But about people. About choices. About pains that changed the way we walk. She wrote in notebooks, on loose sheets of paper, on napkins. It was a way to organize the inner storm, to transform the chaos into something that, at least on paper, made sense. One of her texts was read aloud at a small literary event she shyly decided to attend. When she finished reading, a woman approached and said, "You write like someone who has loved and lost. That's why it touches us." Elena smiled. Perhaps that was the way. To touch, without hurting anymore. Daniel, on the other hand, was preparing a trip with his new partner. It wasn't an escape, but a celebration. They had endured hardships and trials, and now they wanted to mark the new cycle. During his preparations, he opened an old folder where he kept documents from past trips. He found a letter he'd never sent, written in a moment of pain. He read it distantly. And then tore it up. There was no longer any point in keeping traces of a time that no longer hurt. Before leaving, he stopped by the bookstore again. He bought the same French book from years ago, now in a new edition. He gave it to his current partner as a gift, and upon handing it over, he said, "It was with this book that my story with someone began. Today, I wanted to continue with you." And as Elena closed the curtains of her new home to write another page of her new life, Daniel embarked on a new destiny, with a new love and a soul at peace. They had both reached a point of no return. But also, finally, the freedom to move on. Because, in the end, it's not about forgetting what one has experienced. But about understanding what each choice has built, and destroyed, so that true love can one day blossom again. Months passed until the past became a stable memory within each of us. It didn't fade, it didn't dissolve, but finally rested quietly where it belonged, deep within our memories. Elena had made a commitment to never fool herself again. She no longer romanticized what she had lost, nor fantasized about impossible redemptions. For the first time, she looked at her own journey with enough honesty to understand that the pain she felt was no longer due to Daniel's absence, but rather to what she herself had been able to do with the love she had received. In her new daily life, she tried to build something useful from what remained. The texts she wrote began to gain readers. A small group of women who met monthly to read and share stories invited her to a conversation circle. There, sitting among strangers who bore similar wounds, Elena spoke with a truth that silenced all noise. She talked about how easy it is to lose someone you love when you stop caring, how insidious the feeling that love will endure anything is, and how an impulsive choice can cost everything you've built for years. That day, for the first time in a long time, she felt that perhaps she could transform her pain into something meaningful for someone other than herself. Not as redemption, but as a wake-up call. But not everyone saw it that way. Some still commented behind her back, whispered on social media, rehashed snippets of what happened without knowing the behind-the-scenes, the unseen weight. And as much as she told herself it no longer affected her, there were days when she felt like a sham trying to move on. It was on those days that she wrote with more force, that she expressed in words what she didn't have the courage to say out loud. Some guilt doesn't disappear, it only finds a place to sit in silence. Daniel, on the other hand, lived his life to the fullest. The woman who walked beside him was everything he had always valued, but now recognized with greater clarity. Their relationship was serene, mature, but no less intense. Together they learned the importance of truly being present. There was no more room for games, insecurities, or half-truths. After all, Daniel finally understood that peace was more precious than impulsive passion. On a short trip to the coast, he proposed. He didn't make a long speech, simply saying, "I've lived long enough to know you're the right choice." And she, with tears in her eyes, replied, "And I knew it from the day I saw you talking to the waiter as if you were the owner of the restaurant. Respect is what made me love you." The wedding was simple, in an open garden, surrounded by a few people. Among them, curiously, was Elena's sister. There was no fanfare, no mixed messages. Just the respectful presence of someone who understood that life goes on, and that true love doesn't shout, but remains. However, fate still had one last meeting in store. Years later, at a literary event for independent authors, Elena had her first book published. It wasn't autobiographical, but it carried the weight of someone who lived every detail of what she wrote. During the launch, she signed copies with a serenity that took time to achieve. Until, at the end of the night, while clearing the table, she heard a voice she recognized immediately. It was him. There was no tension. There were no more open wounds. Daniel approached with a polite smile, complimented the book's title, and said he'd read excerpts posted online. He said he liked it, that there was sensitivity in the way she wrote about loss without dramatizing it. She thanked him with a restrained smile, and for a moment, they were silent. Then she asked, almost instinctively, if he was happy. He answered yes, but without euphoria, with the serenity of someone who didn't need to prove anything. And then he added, "You look better too." She nodded. She said she now understood what it meant to truly love. And that if he ever loved someone again, it would be different. More honest, more present, more whole. Daniel looked into her eyes and simply replied, "I hope so." And he left. That night was unlike any other. Elena didn't cry. She didn't feel anger or nostalgia. For the first time, she felt peace. Their story was officially over. No loose ends, no hope, no pain. Simply over. She returned home alone, but not lonely. Now she understood that being alone wasn't the same as being empty. She was finally beginning to feel like she owned her own story. The years continued to pass. Daniel had a daughter with his new wife. The girl grew up surrounded by love, books, and a home where there was no heavy silence. Elena became a respected author, known for her deep and emotional writing. She never again engaged in fleeting relationships. She learned that there is a dignified beauty in waiting for something that truly makes sense. And although true love didn't return in the form she once knew, she knew that, at the very least, she was now someone capable of receiving it without destroying it. In the end, what remained for each was the reflection of their own choices. Daniel rebuilt his life without carrying the past as a burden, but as a lesson. Elena started over alone, carrying with her the knowledge of everything she lost, but also what she learned from it. The man who used her as an instrument of revenge was never seen again. He disappeared as cowards disappear. And his absence, though painful, was the push she needed to look within and transform herself. Now I want to hear from you. What did you think of this story? Comment below, your opinion is very important. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to keep up with new impactful stories like this one. Remember, betrayal destroys. It destroys love, trust, dreams, peace, and the life you've built together. It may seem like a small mistake at the time, but its weight is devastating when you see everything that's been lost. So, never romanticize it, never justify it, never accept betrayal as part of love, because it's the opposite of it. This channel does not support, normalize, or glorify any kind of betrayal. Here, the truth is shown with all its consequences. And may each story serve as a mirror, so that the character's mistakes never become yours.